Will the market for single-player games get smaller and smaller and disappear? The demand for single-player games will always exist, just like art will never die. Single-player games will not die with the development of online games, but the traditional single-player business model needs to be updated. In the past few years, online gaming has gained great development. From the world's mobile games accounted for 72% of the share of the end game, traditional masterpieces are rarely pure single-player, such as GTA V, COD, Big Brother 2, Halo Infinite, Mysterious Sea, The End of the US, The Island of Tsushima and so on, all added to the online mode. Here are 4 reasons why single-player games will not die out. 1. Single-player games fulfill everyone's desire to be the protagonist, while online games do not satisfy such a wide range of needs. Drama games, such as The Last of Us and Red Dead Redemption 2, can give players a high sense of immersion. Immersion is a beautiful experience that can easily be ruined in multiplayer games, as can storytelling. Due to the business model of online gaming, it is not possible to provide a full storyline at once, and one of its shortcomings is that players must be encouraged to stay online at a certain frequency to keep from dropping out of the game. The most common is daily logging in, 5 things to do every day, and leveling up. Genshin Impact, FF14, etc. In the long run, this will make playing the game seem like a part-time job, and these mechanisms will impact the continuity of the storyline to the point where there is no sense of immersion at all. After so many years of development, online games are still at a very low level in this regard, and cannot satisfy story-oriented and immersive players well. The same legendary adventure story is made into single-player and online games. In the former, you can be the hero who saves the world, and you can be the main protagonist who has a strong heart, while in online games, you can only be a passerby, and a backdrop for the rich Kryptonians. People actually want to be heroes, so the AI will perform all kinds of misfortunes and tragic deaths for you without complaint, and only a single-player machine can allow the entire virtual world to develop an awesome plot with you at the center, and only a single-player machine can provide you with a complete plot at one time. It's a completely different experience, so single-player has its own charm. 2. Single-player games offer the option to pause and quit at any time. If a player wants to play a game with a casual mindset, playing for hours when he has time, but not playing for weeks when he doesn't, then his only choice is single-player games. Busy at work, or taking care of the family, all these will cause the player to leave the game for a period of time. 3. Single-player games can provide pure recreation without being forced to compete. Modern online games, whether time-charging mode or prop-charging mode, its focus on shaping the competition between people, such as the King of Honor segment ranking, the original God to show off his wife mechanism. Those who are online 24 hours a day and pay $100,000 a month will make a player who focuses on leisure and entertainment explode in place. That's why such players hate online gaming and prefer to get pleasure from the beautiful and poetic world of single-player gaming. The nature of the business model of online gaming is to extend what can be done in an hour to a week, or what can be achieved in a week to a year. Both time-based and prop-based models fit this mold. Therefore, even if the ARPG online game is claimed to be the most enjoyable battle, it will definitely make you feel bad after you have entered the game for a period of time, so as to form the pressure of payment to prompt the player to pay, or to prompt the player to burn time to level up. The business model of single-player games does not have such a disadvantage, and can almost always allow players to maintain a very fast pace of the game until the end of the pass. That's why impatient gamers don't choose online games. In addition, socialization is not the only benefit. Socialization is the existence of pressure, and not a purely relaxing situation, such as social kidnapping must be online on time. This situation, typical of Warcraft, Sword Art Online 3, single-player games in this point is very relaxed. There is no pressure of competition between players, which means that players will be more relaxed to play the game, is for entertainment and relaxation and play, relative to the re-socialization of the game to see, the player is more likely to check the details of the game, realize the game plot. 4. Single-player games are the pioneer of innovation in the game industry. For example, PS5 brought the industry a super-fast hard disk. In Ratchet & Clank, players no longer have to struggle to drill the wall in order to exchange the loading time. 2 completely different large scenes in the super-fast hard disk support can be instantly switched to a large seamless map. High-speed changes in the scene can be realized. So cool technology to change the industry has always been the game production mechanism. There is no black screen, there is no waiting, no drilling through walls. PS5 handle is a major innovation in the industry, self-adjusting trigger handle touchpad, allowing players to feel a more delicate gaming experience. Walking in the water, walking on the sand can be a difference in the feeling of pulling out a knife, can have the feeling of the blade out of the sheath, more so that the player immersed in the scene. XSX brings the magic of fast recovery. Even if you shut down your computer for a few months, you can boot up and enter the game again and still be in the same state as the last time you played. NS has realized that even when you are 20, 30, 40, 50 years old, you can still enjoy the fun of playing games at any time and any place as an elementary school student, and even if you are old enough, you will never forget your original intention and keep your mission in mind. Operation mode, control structure, screen performance, engine development, design concepts, discussion topics, and other aspects of almost all single-player games to test the waters of breakthroughs. The reason for this is that single-player games, online games, cell phone games faced by the type of players as well as the platform business mechanism, the platform hardware performance determined. Single-player pursues higher audio-visual quality, more profound game connotation, more breakthrough operation experience and other extreme game quality. The key: they have been subjected to enough high-quality games, it is difficult to be fooled. Under normal circumstances are on the game, don't talk about other bullshit. If you want to bring private goods, sorry, to the naughty dog on the column of incense. Therefore, the single-player industry is forced to make breakthroughs in these areas. In order to gain the advantage, the single-player manufacturers will try all the technological breakthroughs. Why are new technologies such as optical tracking, self-developed engines, VR, facial capture, eye tracking systems, etc. applied to single-player games first? Do you expect a mobile game with less equipment than 2 cooling fans to utilize these technologies? Or are there breakthroughs in plot or intent, like Wind Waker, Going to the Moon, Braveheart, or Island games, that have deep intent, adding thoughtful social or philosophical themes to the game, sometimes even requiring the player to have a certain level of literary or artistic experience? The audience of mobile games are light gamers or social gamers, who play what's hot and are guided by marketing to a higher degree. Mobile game revenue sharing, pipeline revenue of 70% to 80% is very illustrative of the problem, right? Online games are in the middle of mobile games and single player. There are high-quality online games such as Beasts of War and FF14 that have a high degree of pursuit of gameplay while at the same time taking care of stable and benign socialization, and there are also What Can't Be Done, forcing Kryptonite to be the #1 crummy work. However, because online games need to maximize the care of all players, so the configuration requirements will not be too high. The majority of mobile gamers do not read the plot. As for online games, in order to understand the plot, such as me, in order to understand the World of Warcraft, all the tasks are finished, but also to buy the official novel to make up for the plot of the player is not common. As for the virtual joystick, which is used in 90% of all mobile games, I'm not sure how to get players to use the virtual joystick. Of course, in terms of how to let players Kryptonite this aspect or handheld game is better, psychological game research full marks. So I can't think of any reason why single-player gaming is going down. The pursuit of excellence and the search for breakthroughs is the driving force behind the advancement of an industry. Most people are using 1060 or even lower graphics cards. As life gets better, more people will have stable and independent time and space to enjoy the ultimate experience of single-player gaming. 5. single-player games are conducive to IP construction. Single-player immersion is conducive to the construction of IP. Online games, there is a competitive pressure between players. Every look at the dialogue means that I am slower than others. Purely online gaming creates a lack of content and fails to build an IP that will be accepted by a wide range of players. Online battles can successfully consume a lot of players' time, but fail to create story content that players will remember. For example, Battlefield 5 was played for 200 hours, of which less than 5 hours were spent playing campaigns, but without the hours of flow of the single-player mode, the game would not have been purchased. Titanfall and Star Wars Frontier were analyzed through big data and considered the single-player mode to be optional, and the result was that the market response was quite bad, so the sequels of these two games added single-player campaigns. Finally, a not necessarily appropriate analogy, single-player campaign is like a dish, IP, multiplayer connection is like a meal, consume player time, a meal in the rice is bound to eat more than the dish, but there is no dish, you can dry swallow white rice? After analyzing the market demand, we should know the single-player games will not die out of the reason, condensed into one sentence, there is a demand for the market. But there are still people who have doubts. Before 2025, Sony CEO Jim's plan is to vigorously develop online service games and PC, mobile game business, rather than vigorously develop single-player. Because the three main points written above only explains the reasons why single-player will not die out, but does not say that single-player games can cover the needs of the customer base of online and mobile games, who play games is a different set of very different logic. The reality is that each form of entertainment, single-player, online, and mobile, has a corresponding customer base, and it's not a conflict for Sony to go into the online and mobile game markets at the same time as it's trying to capture console customers. Jim wants to optimize the PS game lineup, not to put all the eggs in one basket, so to enter the online game mobile game. The traditional single-player games have been developed for decades, its business model in the process of competing for customers with online games mobile games is gradually struggling. According to the largest U.S. market research organization, in the first quarter of 2021 statistics of the U.S. PS and Xbox players only 19% of the time spent on offline games, it is clear that the cost of the 3A single-player games have been hit by a huge impact on the single-player games market. In order to get a better development is really needed. The single-player game market really needs to be revolutionized in order to achieve better development. The direction of innovation. 1. 3A single-player games will become less and less, but single-player independent games will become more and more. In the past 2 years, PS has produced about 10 masterpieces, Xbox has produced 2, but PS, Xbox, NS, Steam on the birth of independent games in the thousands. 2. The rapid development of AI technology will increase the richness of single-player game content. Highly intelligent NPC interaction with the player can happen, fantastic reaction, can talk about love with it, and side by side with it to fight, increase the content and fun of the game, do not need other players to meet most players, even more than the online game can meet. 3. Stand-alone end card kryptonite, so as to enhance the profitability, but the main body is still stand-alone, such as the Genshin Impact, R-Knights, Langrisser. R-Knights is even so extreme that it doesn't even have a chat channel or leaderboards, which doesn't detract from the fact that it's one of the most successful mobile games of the year. There are many reasons why there are fewer and fewer 3A single-player games. Take Final Fantasy as an example to understand. The Final Fantasy series is a popular IP with the highest historical status and strongest continuity in the global gaming industry. Since its birth in 1987, its 15 regular works and more than 30 spin-offs have a total sales volume of more than 150 million, and it has extended from single-player games to online and mobile games. The rise of Final Fantasy is a product of the golden age of Japanese game makers and the global expansion of Japanese culture. In recent years, due to the high cost of game development, the concentration of risk, and the shrinking of the Japanese market, the Final Fantasy series has entered a period of decline, and its cross-border expansion into the movie and television industry has also ended in failure. The production company had to repeatedly speculate on cold rice in order to increase the realization of IP, but overdrawing the value of IP, causing players and media to turn against it collectively. This profound historical lesson is worthwhile for the game industry. This is a profound historical lesson that game manufacturers should learn from. Final Fantasy was once the least IP-like IP, completely violating the principle of IP economics. It relied on innovation and product recalculation to achieve sustainable development. It was only when it inevitably went downhill that it thought of relying on IP to maintain its commercial value. This shows that in the entertainment industry, the role of IP itself is far less important than investors think, and it is just a piece of the puzzle for success. Since 2007, the Final Fantasy series has been trying to make a comeback in the mobile gaming market, but the results have been mediocre. After all, the mobile gaming market has its limitations, and players' willingness to pay for classic IP is decreasing. Moreover, the excessive development of mobile games has led to a significant decline in the reputation of the Final Fantasy IP, and has also sounded the alarm for other classic IP handheld game transplants. The rise of the Final Fantasy series from the late 1980s to its peak in the 2000s was the result of a combination of inevitability and chance. It was inevitable that a group of world-class developers and IPs would be born from the then world-leading and fast-developing Japanese gaming industry. It was chance that Square, a small and obscure manufacturer, was able to gather a group of excellent production talents and move from imitation to innovation. This is serendipity. After its early successes, Square continued to build on its technical and creative strengths, taking the Final Fantasy series to unprecedented heights. In 1983, Nintendo announced the birth of the contemporary game industry with the release of the groundbreaking FC, Famicom, game console, also known as the Red and White. Within just 3 or 4 years, game consoles entered tens of millions of homes in Japan, the US, Europe, and Southeast Asia, and video games became a mainstream form of family entertainment. Prior to that, most people had to travel to arcade halls to play games, or use expensive and rare early computers to play games. Nintendo's domination of the game industry lasted for 2 generations, FC in the 1980s, and SFC, Super Famicom, in the 1990s. For more than a decade, gamers around the world were accustomed to sitting in front of their televisions, inserting a cassette into a Nintendo console, and picking up the joystick to enjoy a relaxing time of entertainment. However, gamers soon realized a problem: most games were too simple to provide enough playtime and lacked challenge. The mainstream games of the time took less than 10 minutes to complete, and even the big, transcendent titles like Super Mario only took a few hours. In addition, most of the 1980s games belonged to 2 genres, action and shooting. Platform action represented by Super Mario, flying shooting represented by Salmon Snake, and action fighting represented by WrestleMania. Could provide players with novel experiences, but after the novelty was gone, they were left with the impression of the same old thing. The same old impression will be left behind after the novelty is gone. Can video games be made deeper and wider? Could it take up more of the user's time? Everyone wanted to know. In 1986, Japanese game developer Enix gave the answer by releasing Dragon Quest, the world's first massively commercialized RPG. Early RPGs such as Wizardry and Ultima had already appeared in the United States, but they could only run on PCs, which were not widely available at the time, and the gameplay was too cumbersome and lacked a popular base. Through a series of modifications and innovations, Dragon Quest has made RPGs a game genre accepted by mainstream gamers for the first time: a simple but complete plot, turn-based battles, large maps to explore and scenery to switch between, multi-character teaming game modes, and a strong swords and sorcery fantasy style. Many of these features remain in place to this day. For the first time, players found a game worth spending dozens of hours on, with a huge world to explore and a linear storyline to experience. Dragon Quest was a milestone. Meanwhile, Square, a small, fledgling developer, was struggling on the edge of life and death. By 1986, Square had released 6 games for both PC and FC platforms, including adventure, action, and shooting genres, all of which ended in failure. Hironobu Sakaguchi, the head of research and development, proposed to develop an RPG several times, but the company rejected all of them. The popularity of Dragon Quest changed the minds of the company's management, and they finally allowed Hironobu Sakaguchi to develop an RPG with a similar theme. Based on Dragon Quest, Hironobu Sakaguchi made some innovations. Players could choose from professions such as warrior, thief, and wizard. Dragon Quest had no professions, thus creating a unique adventure team. The battle screen was set to the third person. Dragon Quest was the first person, which allowed for more information, and the plot was significantly better than that of Dragon Quest. The plot is also significantly deeper and more complex than Dragon Quest. Given the uncertainty of its success, Hironobu Sakaguchi titled it Final Fantasy. If it hadn't succeeded, it would have been Square's last game before it went bankrupt. Luckily, the gamble ended in victory. Final Fantasy sold 400,000 copies in its debut, which was only a fifth of what Dragon Quest did, but enough to keep Square afloat. From then on, Hironobu Sakaguchi was given absolute autonomy to form a team and develop products. Since then, the Final Fantasy series has continued to release a new game every 1 to 2 years. By the time Final Fantasy V was released in 1992, the series was recognized as one of Japan's top 2 national RPGs alongside Dragon Quest, and had achieved some success in the North American and European markets as well. Square was catapulted to the top of the global game companies almost exclusively because of the Final Fantasy series. Final Fantasy was undoubtedly born as a result of imitating Dragon Quest and the earlier Wizardry and Ultima. After all, innovation is about being the first to imitate, and imitation is a cost-effective strategy. The key lies in the fact that after Square gained a firm foothold through imitation, it began bold reforms and trial and error. Final Fantasy II went so far as to abolish the upgrade system. Generation 3 restored the upgrade system and introduced a more complex transfer system. Generation 4 changed the traditional turn-based system into a semi-real-time system, and Generation 5 introduced the ability value system, which is independent of the experience value. The ability value system was introduced in Generation 5, which is independent of the experience value. For players, each generation of Final Fantasy brings a lot of new ideas, and the degree of completion is very high, with almost no major loopholes. And, as development technology continues to advance, the depth and presentation of the game continues to improve. For the RPG genre as a whole, the 1980s and 90s were also a golden age. Console hardware was not yet developed enough to handle complex data, and the visual effects offered were limited. FPS, SLG, RTS, ARPG, sandbox, etc., which are all popular nowadays, could hardly excel on the hardware at that time. In contrast, the turn-based RPGs represented by Final Fantasy and Dragon Quest were like a fish out of water. They didn't require a lot of real-time data processing, the requirements for screen quality weren't too high, and the overall storage capacity of the game was within an acceptable range. Final Fantasy was on the right side of the wind, had a head start, and expanded that advantage as quickly as possible. Thus, success became a probable event. From the late 1980s to the early 1990s, Final Fantasy was always a slight underdog to Dragon Quest. From the late 1980s to the early 1990s, Final Fantasy was always a slight underdog to Dragon Quest. The latter was the spiritual centerpiece of the Japanese nation, causing tens of thousands of class cancellations, absenteeism, and even the attention of the Japanese government on its release day. Although the quality of the former is not inferior to that of the latter, its popularity and market share is far less. Dragon Quest sold over 2 million copies in Japan in its first generation, while Final Fantasy didn't do so until its fifth generation. However, in the mid-1990s, the situation changed subtly. Dragon Quest's frequency of new releases dropped dramatically, often with a 3 to 5 year hiatus, and the quality of its work was seriously unstable, while Final Fantasy maintained a high frequency of releases, with word of mouth and sales increasing, and several spin-offs were released. As we enter the 21st century, Dragon Quest is clearly lagging behind Final Fantasy in the global marketplace, and even in Japan it is struggling to maintain its dominance. Why is this? The answer lies in the control of the content. The development and distribution of Final Fantasy was handled by Square, and the development team is highly stable and deeply attached to the IP. However, Enix, the publisher of Dragon Quest, is not responsible for the development of the game, and most of the development work was done by a third party. Although Dragon Quest's creative team remained largely stable, progress and finalization were difficult to guarantee. In the late 1990s, the problem became worse. The development team for Final Fantasy VII remained over 100 people, while Dragon Quest VII had only 35. The Final Fantasy series was able to develop 2 or 3 titles at a time, while the Dragon Quest series had to be delayed. Additionally, the outsourcing model made it difficult for Enix to keep up with technological advances. By the time Dragon Quest VII was released in 2000, the graphics quality was already more than 3 years behind mainstream games. The success of the Final Fantasy series is first and foremost the success of the creative team. In the first 5 generations, producer and master planner Hironobu Sakaguchi, designer Yoshitaka Amano, and composer Nobuo Uematsu formed the Iron Triangle, and they possessed a deep understanding of the IP of Final Fantasy and a strong passion for it. Starting from the 6th generation, Hironobu Sakaguchi gradually left the front line, but the producer Shinji Hashimoto, the planner Yoshifumi Kitase, and Hiroyuki Ito, whom he nurtured, perfectly took over the heavy responsibility. At the same time, Square produced new blood such as designers Tetsuya Takahashi and Tetsuya Nomura, screenwriters Kazunari Nojima and Masato Kato, and musician Naoshi Mizuta, etc. In the early 2000s, most of the members of the Final Fantasy development team had more than one title under their belts, which was very favorable to the continuity of the IP. Years later, when Nintendo president Satoshi Iwata asked why the early Final Fantasy titles were able to achieve such high quality and fast development speeds, Hironobu Sakaguchi replied, "The game industry was in the midst of rapid development of hardware and software technology, and the needs of gamers were rapidly evolving. The trend-setting and innovative spirit of Square was prevalent throughout the organization. Square was permeated with a trend-setting sense of innovation, and every employee thought that what he or she was doing would affect the whole world, and even regarded innovation as his or her own obligation, so he or she never felt tired. This kind of energetic spirit is rare in the game industry in any country." It must be recognized that Square's content development advantage was based on a major premise. In the 1990s, the overall strength of European and American game makers was weaker than that of Japanese makers, and it was difficult for them to even achieve mainstream market status. The European and American gaming giants we know today, such as EA, Ubisoft, and Activision Blizzard, all started their careers with PC gaming, which was not the most mainstream gaming platform at the time. In the categories of action shooting, fighting, RPGs, etc., where Japanese companies excelled, the presence of European and American companies was very weak, and the highly developed Japanese economy in the 1990s provided Japanese companies with inexhaustible market resources and capital advantages. In other words, if Square was not a Japanese company, it would not have been able to develop such a strong IP as Final Fantasy, and the collapse of the Japanese economy and the advancement of technology in Europe and the US set the stage for the decline of the Final Fantasy series after the 2000s. Although North America lacked world-class game makers in the 1990s, it did not lack gamers. Nintendo's Super Mario series and Sega's Sonic series were both huge successes in the United States. North American gamers were no strangers to RPGs, as early RPGs such as Wizardry and Ultima originated in the US, and the late 1990s saw RPG hits such as Gates of Wizardry and Hakata no Monday. As a result, the Final Fantasy series has been cultivating the North American market since 1990. During the localization process, the production team would not only translate the game text into English, but also make substantial modifications to the scenes, characters, and even gameplay to cater to the usage habits and culture of North American users. On the eve of the release of Final Fantasy VI in 1994, Square launched a large-scale marketing campaign in North America. Europe also became a key marketing region for the first time. Until the sixth generation, the Final Fantasy series had only limited commercial success in Europe and the United States. Its total sales in these regions were weaker than those of the Dragon Quest series, not to mention being on par with classic Japanese games such as Super Mario, Legend of Zelda, and Sonic. However, the IP image of Final Fantasy has been firmly established, and turn-based RPG equals Dragon Quest. Final Fantasy has been recognized by European and American gamers. Starting from the sixth generation, the plot and art style of the Final Fantasy series has gradually become more sci-fi, which is easier for European and American gamers to accept. All it took was one groundbreaking installment to take the European and American markets by storm, and that installment was Final Fantasy VII. In the mid-1990s, the game industry faced unprecedented technological changes. Advances in computer graphics made 3D graphics a reality. The popularity of CD-ROM media dramatically increased game storage space, and advances in multimedia technology gave consoles and PCs the ability to display complex animation and sound effects. The mainstream viewpoint of the game industry at that time was that future games should be cinematic, and the ultimate game would be an interactive movie. It should be said that the game industry is still moving towards this goal. From the start of Final Fantasy VII's development in 1994, Square decided that it would be a true 3D game. Specifically, the characters were to be modeled in 3D, and the environments were to be modeled in 2D with 2D decals. It was still a far cry from full 3D modeling, but it was the best solution that could be achieved at the time. In order to realize the cinematic narrative, a large number of 3D animations will be inserted into the game, and the length of the plot will be the highest in history. In order to achieve this, Square invested $40 million in R&D and built a 150-person R&D team. The scale of this investment was appalling at the time, and is still enough to develop a game of the highest caliber today. In terms of plot, Square abandoned the old sword and sorcery style in favor of science fiction. In Final Fantasy VII, players can see spaceships, laser swords, genetic modification, and other space opera-style settings. The characters and story are obviously more complex and grim than its predecessor, with elements of tragedy and fatalism, making it more suitable for older gamers and consuming a longer playing time. To be fair, the plot of Final Fantasy VII is on par with that of a top-notch sci-fi movie. The problem was that the mainstream Nintendo SFC platform, as well as the N64 platform that Nintendo was developing at the time, did not have the graphics processing power and storage space to support the ambitions of Final Fantasy VII. After much deliberation, Square announced in February 1996 that Final Fantasy VII would be shifted to Sony's PS platform, which was more 3D and utilized optical media. It was a risky decision, and who would have predicted that Sony would be able to beat the rising Nintendo? But when the product was released in 1997, all doubts were put to rest. The majestic cities, deep dark streets, and expressive characters of were an interactive movie. By comparison, all the previous games looked too simple. The total sales of the first release of Final Fantasy VII surpassed 9 million copies. It was the top-selling new game in Japan, North America, and Europe. It accomplished a triple mission. First, it made 3D modeling and cinematic storytelling an undisputed staple of the gaming industry. Second, it allowed Sony's PS to undisputedly win the competition for gaming platforms in the late 1990s, and finally, it made RPGs, especially turn-based RPGs, an undisputed marketplace staple in the decade that followed. The final step was to make RPGs, especially turn-based RPGs, the undisputed marketplace of the next decade. After the success of Final Fantasy VII, Square was at an all-time high in terms of technology, capital, branding, and morale, and could do virtually anything. 1999 saw the release of Final Fantasy VIII, whose opening and closing animations are still considered to be some of the highest in the entire history of gaming. The 3D modeling technology, which hadn't matured in the previous generation, was greatly optimized, and the character designs were much more realistic and vivid. More importantly, Square was clearly developing the game with pop culture in mind. The main plot line revolved around a love story, which had never been done before. The theme song, the famous Eyes on Me, was sung by real people for the first time, and sci-fi, magic, suspense, and even time travel were emphasized like never before. The Hollywood elements such as sci-fi, magic, suspense and even travel have been emphasized like never before. Final Fantasy VIII is not an isolated game, but carries a deep imprint of the global pop culture of the late 1990s. Square's efforts in Europe and the United States bore fruit. More than half of Final Fantasy VIII's 8 million sales came from Europe and the United States, and it won the Game of the Year award voted by North American gamers. Encouraged by this, Square began to seriously consider collaborating with Disney and other American entertainment giants, which led to the popular Crusader Kings series. 2000 saw the release of Final Fantasy IX, which was a clear move towards an American cartoon art style, and the readoption of the medieval sword and sorcery storyline. It also reintroduced the medieval sword and sorcery plot. This was an important attempt to diversify and globalize the Final Fantasy series, but unfortunately it didn't work out too well, as players were used to the realism and sci-fi settings. The sales of the first release of Final Fantasy IX only exceeded 5 million, far below the level of the previous two installments. The awkward thing is that Hironobu Sakaguchi was heavily involved in the project, even writing the screenplay himself. It's an ominous sign. The older Final Fantasy creators may be losing their sense of what the market wants, and Square can't stay ahead of the curve forever. Regardless, the 2001 release of Final Fantasy X was enough to put Square back in the driver's seat. Thanks to the computing power of Sony's PS2 platform, the game's characters and scenes were modeled in 3D, the quality of the graphics increased dramatically, live-action voices were introduced, and the length of the 3D animations was at an all-time high. The entire game uses motion capture and expression capture technology, which has only just matured in the movie industry. If Generation 7 was cinematic, then Generation 10 is dreamlike, and the impact on the player is almost impossible to replicate. The game's plot is a typical love tragedy, not only imaginative, but also extremely cruel. At the beginning of the 21st century, I wonder how many gamers had posters of the heroine Yuna hanging on their walls, and how many of them listened to the theme song and sighed at the sad ending of the game. The first release of Final Fantasy X has once again sold more than 8 million copies, and 2/3 of them came from outside of Japan. At this moment, it seems that Final Fantasy can do anything. However, the reality was harsh. While Final Fantasy X was sweeping the charts, Square was on the verge of bankruptcy. In February 2001, producer Hironobu Sakaguchi resigned. In October, Square asked Sony for capital to maintain normal operations, and in November, founder and CEO Sho Suzuki resigned. After a series of complicated reorganizations, Square accepted a merger with longtime rival Enix in 2003. The publishers of Final Fantasy and Dragon Quest were finally together, but both companies were on their last legs. The golden age of Final Fantasy was coming to an end. What happened? To this day, people look back on it all and wonder. On the surface, the decline of the Final Fantasy series was the result of a failed IP crossover attempt. In essence, the high cost of game development, the economic downturn in Japan, and the shift in the game industry's focus to North America are the real reasons why Final Fantasy is no longer in the limelight. Unfortunately, Square was not able to properly respond to the challenges and embrace the Internet era in a timely manner. What a painful lesson to learn as Final Fantasy fell off the top of the IP charts in the 2010s. While developing Final Fantasy IX, producer Hironobu Sakaguchi turned most of his attention to the movie side of things. He wanted to direct a sci-fi CG animated movie that represented the highest level of technology at the time, namely Final Fantasy, Spirits Within, for which Square formed a movie company. Over the course of the 4-year production cycle, about 200 developers, more than 1,000 workstations, and $107 million were utilized, and another $30 million was spent on distribution. To be fair, Square's risk was justified. With the commercial success of CG movies like Disney's Toy Story series and DreamWorks' Ants in the late 1990s, it was clear that CG was the future of animation. Final Fantasy's IP was a huge hit. The development team had accumulated a wealth of animation experience, and one of the Hollywood Big Six, Columbia, was willing to handle worldwide distribution. But it turned out to be a nightmare. Final Fantasy, Spirited Away grossed only $85 million worldwide, and the producers and distributors lost a total of $94 million. The media consensus was that Final Fantasy, Soul Survivor was one of the best CG movies of its time, but the plot was poor and the subject matter unappealing. After all, it was Square's first foray into movie making, and the focus was entirely on technology, which caused costs to spiral out of control. The industrial system and business logic of movies are fundamentally different from that of games, but Square had no chance to learn. After huge losses, it got out of the movie business altogether in 2002. It was the saddest ending of all. The lessons learned from a massive $137 million investment were not passed on. Over the next decade, Final Fantasy only released one animated series, one OVA, and one DVD animated movie, all of which were based on cost containment and limited releases, and in 2016, to coincide with the release of Final Fantasy XV, Square licensed an animated movie, Final Fantasy, Sword of the King, to a third party. The movie also performed poorly commercially, grossing only $9 million worldwide. The reason for this was simple. With declining technical capabilities and insufficient funding, Square and its partners were no longer able to produce a world-class movie, and the Final Fantasy IP had long since passed its peak. Even more brutal was the ballooning cost of game development. In 1994, the development team for Final Fantasy VI was only about 50 people and the cost was about $10 million. In 1997, the development team for Generation 7 ballooned to 150 people and the cost was about $40 million, and Generation 8 set a record for the size of the development team at 200 people. Starting in 1999, Square had to maintain large teams in both Japan and the US, and the development cycle increased from 1 year to 2 to 4 years. Marketing expenditures also increased, requiring simultaneous promotional campaigns in major markets around the world. Although Final Fantasy IX sold more than 5 million copies, the return on investment was still low, which was a major reason for Hironobu Sakaguchi's resignation. Why did game development costs go up? Because of technological advances, 2D art has become 3D modeling, which has brought about geometric changes, and players have become more demanding, so the length and depth of game content has to be constantly increased. The worst part was that Square not only couldn't shrink, it had to expand. Investors wanted to see the company develop more IPs beyond Final Fantasy, and gold producers were flocking to Square, leading the company to pump a lot of resources into new projects. By 2001, the situation was irreversible. Peripheral projects were cut, core projects were postponed, massive layoffs and reorganization took place, or the company went bankrupt. The Final Fantasy franchise was crushed by its own success. After nearly 2 years of painful reorganization, a new Square Enix was formed in 2003. Now, the company owns 2 top IPs, Final Fantasy and Dragon Quest, and is still at the top of the production ladder. The company's production capabilities are still among the highest in Japan. However, inside the seemingly shiny shell is no longer the same soul. Early creators such as Hironobu Sakaguchi, Yoshitaka Amano, and Nobuo Uematsu have all left the company, and the management team is filled with newcomers who have no affection for Final Fantasy. Game technology was still advancing at a rapid pace, development costs were still high, and online gaming had emerged as a major growth engine for the industry in just a few short years. Square Enix is no longer strong enough to meet these challenges. Moreover, against the backdrop of a sluggish economy and a shrinking local market, the time for Japanese game companies to make a name for themselves is over. A long period of decline has arrived. The first 10 generations of the Final Fantasy series were all single-player games, and there was no concept of connectivity. The concept of connectivity didn't even exist at the time. However, Square recognized the future of online gaming early on and announced in 2001 that Final Fantasy XI would be in Merpage, at a time when the online gaming industry was still in its infancy and there were only a handful of products on the market, such as Ultima OL, Stone Age, and even text-based MUDs. Theoretically, based on the technology, IP popularity, and financial resources of the single-player era, Final Fantasy would be able to gain an advantage in the Merpage field. However, this was not the case. Final Fantasy XI, released in 2002, sold only 2 million copies and peaked at around 300,000 monthly active users, MAU. The game was well received by the media, it featured a real-time battle system, emphasized teamwork, had a rich career system, and had several large-scale datasheets. Unfortunately, it was a good game rather than an epical masterpiece. It was far less innovative than its contemporaries, such as Endless Quest, EVE Online, and, later, World of Warcraft. The emphasis on teamwork kept a lot of light players away. Although it was a huge success in Japan, its presence in the European and American markets was weak. Final Fantasy XI is based on Sony PS2 and Microsoft Xbox 360 as its main platforms. Although it also has a PC version, it is not emphasized. As a matter of fact, the main battleground for MMORPGs is the PC, and during the same period, Enix's Crossgate was a huge success. To this day, console gamers are more accustomed to single-player games, weakly connected games, and esports games, and are less enthusiastic about MMOs that require long hours of online play. In addition, due to the mindset of the single-player era, Final Fantasy XI still maintains a buy-and-pay system, which greatly limits the size of the player base. After summarizing the lessons learned from the experience, Square Enix released Final Fantasy XIV in 2010, a time-based Merpage, which became the biggest nightmare in the history of Final Fantasy. Although the technical standard was very high, the pacing was too plentiful, the storyline lacked interest, and the interface was poorly designed, which made it the subject of much criticism by players at the beginning of the release. Some media outlets even thought that the gold standard of Final Fantasy would probably be completely destroyed. In 2012, Final Fantasy XIV was forced to shut down its servers and go back to the drawing board, and in 2013, Final Fantasy XIV, Rebirth of the Realm was officially launched, which achieved a certain degree of success, and is still in operation today. Final Fantasy XIV, Rebirth is a well-made, old-school, slow-burning Merpage with some of the highest graphics in its genre, a grandiose plotline, and a wealth of side quests that carry a deep Japanese single-player RPG branding. Unlike World of Warcraft, it is not keen on developing new concepts and gameplay, nor does it tend to be fast-paced and attract rich players like many competitors, but is oriented towards traditional RPG lovers. In the midst of the free-to-play trend, it sticks to the time charge and props charge model. All in all, the game has a good conscience and a long life cycle, but it's unlikely to be a big hit. In the Chinese server represented by Shonda Games, the MAU has never exceeded 200,000, the highest MAU in the world is only around 1 million. Final Fantasy XI and Final Fantasy XIV epitomize Square Enix's fate. In the single-player RPG era, it was the undisputed dominant player and the object of imitation for all. In the Merpage era, it is only a strong competitor, with limited commercial success, not to mention failing to lead the trend. In this era, American companies represented by Blizzard have strong technical strength and financial resources, and can continue to innovate. Chinese and Korean companies represented by Shonda, NetEase, and NCSoft have a huge local market, and can benefit from being the first to imitate. The golden age of Japanese game companies has passed, and Japanese culture is no longer a global powerhouse. Gaming has never been an isolated industry, but rather one that is tied to the overall economic and social changes. The worst thing is, the peak of MMORPGs is over, and it is now the golden age of FPS, MOBA, SPT, and other esports games, and it may be the golden age of sandbox games in the future. In the two categories of esports and sandbox, Japanese companies hardly have any advantage. Square Enix certainly realized the crisis, and tried to rely on Final Fantasy to produce fighting games and action games, but this is only a stopgap measure. In the end, given the shrinking local market, declining technological capabilities, and insufficient capital supply, it was impossible for Japanese companies to achieve great success in new game categories. In the end, Square Enix and its rivals will have to continue on the same old path of traditional RPGs with Japan's unique craftsmanship, even though mainstream gamers are no longer moved by it. While developing MMORPGs, the Final Fantasy series has not stopped developing single-player titles. Generation 10-2 in 2003, Generation 12 in 2006, Generation 13 in 2009, and Generation 15 in 2016 were all single-player or weekly connected games, as well as single-player spin-offs such as Final Fantasy Zero and Final Fantasy Rhythm Theater. Most of the above titles came with some multiplayer connectivity and social play. Unfortunately, Square Enix hasn't had much success in its own home turf, and after Final Fantasy XV in particular, the IP has been relegated to second-rate status. Final Fantasy XII's combat system has been overhauled from its predecessor, the turn-based system has been changed to a real-time system, and a complex command-setting mechanism has been added to make combat automated. The game's career system is also as deep and playable as ever, and there are also many branching copies of the game modeled after MMORPGs. However, the biggest problem is that the game's main storyline is very thin, and the time for players to complete the main storyline is too short. In the end, Square Enix suffered from cost phobia. In order to reduce the risk, we have to control the cost. The best way to control the cost is to control the content of the game, and even go so far as to cut the main storyline. However, how can a single-player RPG that can't even tell a good story attract players? Although the media scores are still very high, gamers' dissatisfaction has already started to spread. Final Fantasy XIII continues on the path of cost-cutting. The storyline has been drastically weakened, scene details are very weak, and even the daily battles have been cut. In fact, players can only follow the main storyline, and the storyline itself lacks impact. While European and American companies are striving to increase the freedom of gameplay and build open worlds, Square Enix is taking a step backwards. Thanks to Final Fantasy's IP popularity, the game sold more than 6 million copies, but media word of mouth was at an all-time low, and sales in Europe and the US declined as a percentage of the total. Given that Final Fantasy XIII was still selling well, Square Enix got carried away and decided to release 2 sequels to that title, Final Fantasy XIII-2 and Thunderstruck Returns. Sales for both titles plummeted, and word of mouth was less than stellar for both. Return of Thunder, in particular, was derided by critics as like a teaching chapter in an page and received the lowest media ratings in the history of Final Fantasy. In these 3 works, the problems of weak plot, insufficient game time and too little freedom persisted. In the minds of gamers, Final Fantasy is a sacred IP that must reach the highest level of RPGs at the time, otherwise it is useless. They will not accept a poorly completed Final Fantasy game that is in a hurry to realize its potential. In fact, Square Enix has already tried hard enough. Final Fantasy XIII and its sequels have been widely praised for their graphical quality, character designs, and battle systems, which are on par with similar games from the big players in the US and Europe. The problem was that the Japanese game makers were no longer strong enough to maintain both quality and finish, making a technically advanced, beautifully drawn, emotionally moving, and sufficiently deep RPG meant huge costs and high risks. After the bankruptcy crisis at the beginning of the 21st century, how would Square Enix dare to repeat its mistakes? The problem of high cost and risk is not only bothering Japanese companies, but also European and American companies. Activision Blizzard, EA, Ubisoft and other major European and American manufacturers have become increasingly conservative since the 2010s, either focusing on the development of annual products with very little innovation, or focusing on the value of a game through the props of in-buy, DLC and other ways to drain the value of a game. In the end, European and American manufacturers also fell into the strange circle of players' bad reviews and the appeal of popular IPs decreasing. Final Fantasy is facing a common problem. Final Fantasy XV, released in 2016, is probably the collapse of this IP. Although sales were good and media ratings were okay, the plot was severely shrunken, the freedom was low, and it was almost a half-baked product. Obviously, the production team doesn't have the resources or the courage to finish the game. At first, players still hoped that subsequent upgrades and DLC could finish the work. However, in November 2018, Square Enix announced that the game's subsequent development had basically ended, shattering players' fantasies. When an IP disappoints fans one after another, it's not far from the end. In the golden age of the Final Fantasy series, it didn't really look like an IP. When the production company realized the importance of IP economics, the IP was precisely on the road to failure. Square Enix did not fail to notice the importance of mobile games, and even took the initiative to transform itself into a mobile game manufacturer, but so far it has not been able to complete the transformation. In the final analysis, the game industry is a fast-changing, ever-changing industry. No one can lie down and make money, and there is no universally applicable business model. Only one thing is certain: gamers are always demanding more content. Today's popular gaming giants can quickly fall into an abyss if they don't have a sense of crisis. Since 2014, IP economics has become the theme word for China's cultural entertainment market, with players in various industries such as gaming, film and television, animation and comics, and music all exploring how to maximize the value of IP. The question is, what is IP, and what is the secret of long-term realization of popular IP? The Final Fantasy series can be considered the number one IP in the global gaming industry, and even after years of decline, it still manages to achieve high sales and influence. However, it's not exactly what people think of as an IP. There is no connection between the plot, characters, or worldviews of the previous generations of Final Fantasy. That's right, no matter how successful the last Final Fantasy was, the next one starts from scratch. We won't see any recurring protagonists, nor will we see any follow-ups to the story. So, in what way is the Final Fantasy series organized? Well, it comes down to what is known as tone or style. First of all, the setting of all Final Fantasy canonical works is extremely large and brutal. Some kind of gigantic evil force wants to destroy the world, and the weak protagonist tries to grow up and defeat it after a hard struggle to restore the balance of the world. Each of these works is a poetic epic that takes the player's breath away and leaves him or her with a huge spiritual impact. Secondly, the Final Fantasy series has always explored the ultimate questions of mankind: life and death, man and nature, love and hate, oppression and resistance, technological advancement and tradition. 7 depicts an anti-utopian society controlled by a large technological corporation, while Generation 8 delves into the shaping of memory. Generation 8 discusses the role of memory in shaping human beings, the second half of Generation 9 revolves around the meaning of life, and Generation 10 portrays breaking the cycle of death with true love. To the purely entertaining gamer, these plots may be too heavy. However, it is precisely because they are heavy that they leave room for reflection and reminiscence. Strictly speaking, The main audience of the Final Fantasy series is the adult gamer with a certain amount of life experience, and, as they get older, they will come back to the series and re-experience it. In addition, the Final Fantasy series has a lot of universal details. Almost every work will appear gold landbirds and airships, so that players can move quickly. Every generation will appear summoning beasts, and the name of the summoning beasts' attributes have a certain degree of commonality. During battle, the player will always hear the same music. The music at the end of the game will always be the same. Many times during the game, the names of the characters are the same. Veterans of the Final Fantasy series will be able to determine if the game belongs to the series within half an hour of starting the game. In short, Final Fantasy's IP affiliation is not inherited through characters or storylines, but through the tone of the content. This is a double-edged sword. Each work is new and has a great deal of freedom. However, it is difficult to inherit the fan base of the previous work, and it is a lot of work to recreate. In 2001, Square, under pressure to go bankrupt, decided to break the mold and develop a sequel to Final Fantasy X, which was released in 2003 as Final Fantasy X-2. The original's tragic ending caused much fan dissatisfaction, and Square was happy to utilize the original's characters and set designs for a second go-around. As a result, Final Fantasy X-2 became a commercial success, and opened a Pandora's box. Square became more and more interested in capitalizing on IP popularity by rehashing the same old stuff rather than innovating. Since then, sequels have been released for the 12th, 13th, and 15th generations, as well as sequels for the 4th and 7th generations, which were released years ago. Some of these sequels have been successful, but most of them have overdrawn the IP value. In short, when the production company realized that IP economics is a way to make money, the IP of Final Fantasy went on the road of eating old money. In the eyes of some investors, IP is a lazy tool that can turn stones into gold and corruption into magic. However, fans will not support any IP unconditionally, and all realizations come at a price, so fishing at the river's edge is definitely not a good choice. As a matter of fact, IP can only be used as icing on the cake, when the production team is full of passion, rich in experience, and not weak in technical strength. Quality IP can help them get twice the result with half the effort. Throughout the 1990s, the Final Fantasy production team led by Hironobu Sakaguchi continued to innovate, accumulating new capital for the IP instead of eating the same old money. They even deliberately developed several new IPs with different creative ideas. When Square decided to develop Final Fantasy X-2, Hironobu Sakaguchi chose to leave the company. When Square decided to develop Final Fantasy X-2, Hironobu Sakaguchi chose to leave the company. He knew better than anyone that it was always easier to destroy an IP than to create one, and that any compromise on principle would lead to an impasse. Since the release of the iPhone in 2007, smartphones have become a major gaming platform. Now, the vast majority of the global gaming market is coming from mobile games, with traditional console and PC platforms overshadowing them. Many traditional manufacturers in Europe, the United States and Japan have failed to seize this wave of mobile games, but Square Enix is an exception. It has enthusiastically embraced the mobile gaming market since 2007, and has independently licensed the development of many Final Fantasy-themed mobile games. At the same time, it has also ported many of the canonical titles in the Final Fantasy series to mobile platforms. Given Square Enix's passion for mobile gaming, many gamers refer to it as a mobile game powerhouse. However, it has not been particularly successful in the mobile gaming space, and can only be considered a pseudo-mobile game powerhouse at best. For one thing, until 2017, the company was torn between a pay model and a free model, even though the pay model proved to be a poor fit for mobile gamers. Final Fantasy XV Pocket Edition, which was customized for mobile platforms, has adopted a free first chapter and paid subsequent chapters model. The result was a double whammy. Traditional gamers felt that releasing a mobile version of the game itself compromised the IP nature of Final Fantasy XV, and mobile gamers weren't accustomed to paying for plot chapters. Of course, Square Enix has also tried the free download and props business model, the most successful of which is the 2015 launch of Final Fantasy, Brave Revelation, which will be introduced to China by Zixinju in 2018. However, more mobile game titles have ended in failure or mediocrity. According to our observation, about one-third of the Final Fantasy-themed mobile games released before 2015 are no longer in operation, and most of the remaining ones are only commercially successful in Japan or a few countries. Because Square Enix's development capacity is limited, it often licenses the development of Final Fantasy-themed mobile games to third parties, which makes it difficult to control the quality of the work. For example, Final Fantasy XV, The New Empire, which was developed by a third party in 2017, received a lot of bad reviews. Even if the production quality of the mobile game itself is good, the IP fervor of Final Fantasy has long been in decline, and it is difficult to independently support a hit product. In China, for example, today's mobile game players are most looking forward to either Diablo, World of Warcraft, FIFA, such as Europe and the United States, or Sword and Hero, Stone Age, Perfect World, such as the Chinese and South Korean classic IP. 2016 year-end, the perfect world of the development of the Final Fantasy, Awakening ARPG mobile game, although the quality of the game is still good, but also in the IO's top 100 best-selling list. Although the quality of the ARPG developed by Perfect World at the end of 2016 was quite good, it only stayed in the top 100 of the IO's bestseller list for less than 2 months. Assuming that Square Enix can focus on strong R&D forces, or find a suitable third-party developer to make a top Final Fantasy page, then its performance in the Chinese market can only reach the level of Langrisser or Crossgate handheld game at best, the first 1 to 2 months at the top of the bestseller list, and then quickly decline. In the European and American markets, MMORPGs have never been the most mainstream mobile game category, and the Final Fantasy series is hardly a hit. In the Japanese market, the series still maintains a high popularity, but the scale of mobile game consumption in Japan is already very limited. In short, it is very unlikely that Final Fantasy will be revitalized through mobile games. 2017's Final Fantasy XV Pocket Edition was an awkward attempt. It was well done, it won media reviews and App Store editorial recommendations in several countries, but with only 3 million total downloads and about 2 million paid downloads, it was far from a commercial success. It was well done and won favorable reviews from the media and editorial recommendations from the App Store in several countries. However, with only 3 million total downloads and about 2 million paid downloads, it was far from a commercial success. In the end, Square Enix even ported the game back to console and PC platforms because players on these platforms can contribute higher ARPU value. This is a strange phenomenon. Square Enix still hasn't figured out how to develop and operate mobile games. Its Chinese and Korean counterparts, despite their weak history, are better adapted to the times. Another important issue is that the trend of increasing game development costs has not stopped, and now the development of mobile games has also entered the era of money. If this goes on, one day, only a few big companies can develop explosive games, the player's choice is greatly narrowed, innovation is also impossible to talk about. This phenomenon has occurred in the host platform. In the mobile game market, how to develop a niche market, maintain a variety of flowers, from the niche products to find the next generation of explosive creativity, is the common challenge of mainstream publishers. In this creativity-oriented industry, the lack of new categories, new ways of playing means extinction. From the above examples, we can understand that launching a 3A single-player game is like gambling, and it's basically very difficult to win every time you gamble. If the major players fail to find the direction of innovation, the whole market will be stuck in a quagmire.